All right, welcome, my relatives, to another edition of Warrior Evolution Podcast. This is your host, Dan Gorbino, and I'm really super amped to be here. It's been a while here at Homestead Studios. Big thank you and shout out to John Anderson and for his work in supporting this, and to all of you for listening, watching this, liking our videos, subscribing. If you haven't yet, please go to Warrior Vox on YouTube. It's the channel that hosts these videos. We do it as a video, and also on Spotify as a podcast. That being said, I'm really excited to continue the conversations we've had about healing, about men's work, about consciousness, and all the different ways that we can look at healing and recovery and personal work as community work and vice versa. You know, we're all in this together. And of all the things I've learned as I've grown in my own work and increasingly in support of others on their journeys, especially men in residential treatment and dual recovery centers, it is really about having the courage and the support to go in. You know, I think it's a time that we're in now, in a great shift of society. Even as a lot of evidence of the old ways are crumbling, there's a new frontier opening up, which is increasingly inward and focused and conscious. And it's really an invitation to go in and do our work. And I was thinking of, like, if I were to give it one symbol or one metaphor, I think it's the mirror. You know, we're at the time of the great reflection about what we're doing and the attitudes, the energies, and the mind in which we're going into our lives and into solving some of the big problems that are facing us. So it's big territory, I get it, and a lot of us are in this conversation in our life right now. And we need advisors, mentors, and guides to help us navigate this territory. So with that in mind, I invite into the conversation today Dr. Michael Obsatz. I first met Mike when I was executive director for Boys to Men mentoring programs, and he was a part of that great work to get the Journeyman film out about boys and men mentoring. And increasingly, Mike is available as an ally, support, and friend and mentor to me, and I know to many other men. So I'd like to officially welcome you, Mike, into the conversation and say a few words about you to help other people understand some of the work that you've done. So I'm just going to read this here. Mike is a professor emeritus from Macalester College. He taught sociology and education courses at Macalester for 40 years. Also, he was a therapist in private practice, men's group leader, boys group leader, workshop presenter, and author. His book, Raising Nonviolent Children in a Violent World, won the 1999 Minnesota Book Award and the Catholic Press Association Award. His other books are Open Our Eyes, Healing Our Anger, and From Stalemate to Soulmate. Mike's documentary about mentoring called Journeyman also won 2 film festival awards and has been seen by over 3 million people. Here to join us in the conversation about consciousness and getting to understand how that ties into the things that we're going through now. Please welcome to have you, sir, Dr. Michael Obsatz.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
All right. I was recently a part of the Richard Rohr conference, and it was all about, you know, signature conversation topic that you have really put a lot of thought and energy into, and that is about empire consciousness and why that's important now. So could we just sort of just dive into that and just how does that, why is that important right now with the things that are happening, and what is happening?
Okay. I'm going to start with a little bit of personal information and then get into that. When I was growing up, I was bullied for 7 years by a group of people who were young men who hated me because I was Jewish. And I was beaten and I was harassed and I was shamed, and nobody would do anything about it. It was almost like, be a man and, you know, stand up to it. Well, I said, there's 7 of them. How do you stand up to 7 guys? And what that did for me, was really get me into, well, why is the culture like this? Why is there so much hatred? Why do people want to hurt other people? And when I started getting teaching college, I got involved in the men's movement because one of the things that happens is as men are socialized into an empire consciousness, which I'll talk about in a minute, um, they lose parts of themselves and they spend their life grieving. And the two aspects of grieving that are most powerful are anger and depression. So we have a lot of rage out there, and we have a lot of isolation, and we have a lot of depression. All of that contributes to violence, addiction, and all kinds of dysfunction in a culture. And you don't solve it by legislating a law about it. You solve it by people really starting to look at how boys are raised, what men are taught, and why men need to prove themselves in this kind of way, which is to dominate, control, and hurt other people who they perceive as weaker or different. I am convinced that hatred of others comes from self hatred, and self hatred comes from not really feeling loved and not really loving yourself and not being spiritually connected. Now, empire consciousness, there have been empires historically for many, many years. There's the Greek Empire and the Roman Empire and the Ottoman Empire and the British Empire. And I will add the American Empire, because the people who came over to America were oppressed by empire where they were and came over here and then took the oppressor role.
Mm.
So the role, was like that was in their consciousness. You either are oppressed or you're the oppressor.
Mm.
And that way of looking at life is a kind of consciousness. It's a kind of belief system. It's a worldview that creates 99% of all the problems that we have. It creates problems with attitudes toward women. It creates, any of the isms, racism, what happened to Native Americans in America because they were not seen as part of the ruling class. They were oppressed and everything was taken away from them. And as a child, everything was taken away from me too. My feeling of safety, my feeling of knowing that I was going to be all right, my feeling that I would be supported by adults in my life. It was a tremendous loss experience. And I started trying to understand, going through the men's movement, like, why do we do this? Why do we raise boys like this? And I attended a number of Robert Bly workshops, and Robert Bly, really was an incredible man who really understood what men lose as they grow up, all the losses. Since that time, I have done a lot of work with men and a lot of work with boys, and really looking at the whole cultural context, the whole societal context of male socialization. Because I'm a social psychologist, I'm many things, but that's one of the things. I also got into Ann Wilson Schaef's work, where she talked about when society becomes an addict. And empire is always about addiction.
Well,
It's always about never being enough, never having enough. And it's also about external validation, meaning that you have to get validation from the outside because you don't feel validated on the inside. So healing this is a return to love. Like Marianne Williamson says, a return to our inner core of loving ourselves and knowing who we are and appreciating that. Now, we do have anger but we need to moderate it and control it in a healthy way. We do have parts of ourselves. We have the warrior, the lover, the different archetypes, the magician and the king. And all of these have a shadow side. And if people don't mature in a healthy way, then the shadow stuff starts coming out. And what Robert Bly used the term, I thought it was really interesting. It was called the immature masculine. When the shadow was coming out, it was the immature masculine. So I wrote a piece called Oh, Grow Up, which is about, okay, what we really need to do is grow up. We also have to grow into love for ourselves and for everyone. So the antidote to empire consciousness is oneness consciousness. You see the divinity in the diversity. You see the lovability in everyone, and you are loved, you are lovable, and you are loving. And if we can feel loved, spiritually loved, maybe have a good support group around us that we feel loved by too. Sometimes family of origins provide this, sometimes they don't. I tell people, well, that's how you got here. Now you create your lovable family, and you just create whoever loves you, and you put that all together, and you hang around with those people instead of being so upset about what you didn't get from mom and dad, who are just your biological origins here. Okay, I mean, we really want to feel connected and loved by our parents. Not everybody has perfect parents. And most people have experienced abandonment and shame. And when you feel abandonment and shame, it moves into self-hatred, which then gets projected out into the world. And with empire consciousness, one of the key things about it is it's a feeling of scarcity. There's not enough to go around. So I have to take from you because I don't have enough and I won't have enough. So there's whole scarcity, domination, control is all a reaction against the abandonment, the shame, and the loss that you feel when you're not loved for who you really are on the inside. And public schools can teach you how to hierarchically fit into an empire. Best papers on the wall. We have the not best papers not on the bulletin boards. We give better grades to quote smarter kids. There's this whole idea that you're competing against everybody, and this competition obsession goes along with addiction, power, control, and also isolation and hurt. So hurt people hurt people.
And on it goes.
And on it goes. So that's a whole lot of sort of introduction, but I wanted to give a context for why this is important to me. And then just recently, I mean, with the George Floyd experience, with the Locke experience and so on, it's all about fear. And it's all about people in power having fear. And the fear is once you have an empire and you have a hierarchy, there's always a fear of retaliation. Because deep in your heart, you know you're oppressing somebody and you're afraid they're going to rebel, which is how America started in terms of the British people coming over and rebelling against the oppression. It's really interesting that America came out of rebellion against oppression. However, the work that needed to be done for healing probably was not done well enough to create a really new system. There are ideals, but they're not often lived out. And sometimes they are, but for the most part, we have a long way to go before we see the divinity and the diversity. And by divinity, I mean the holiness in each person, the specialness, the lovability of each person. And you could call that a spiritual thing. You can call it God connected. People could have different names for it. But once you start feeling that, your behavior changes and you start having more love for yourself, and then you have more love for other people. So self-love always can lead to compassion and respect and acceptance of others. So that sort of gives you an idea of where I come from.
Wow. What I really appreciate about what you're offering here is not just a handle on what's going on, which is hard to get our arms around anyway. What's the nature of the problem, right? Like if you can diagnose the imbalance, you're halfway home. This is like an old Chinese medical saying, like half the cure is in proper diagnosis. Like once you understand the pattern, that gives you a foothold to do something about it. So I think in what you're talking about, these sort of archetypal energies and deep-rooted traumas that are just rampant within the system that are causing these projections of this kind of other kind of consciousness. It has to be called out, right? And so you're doing that, and you're giving us a sense of what is that train about, and what's in there, what are the pieces in there. Well, that's brilliant. And then and what I like about what you're offering is that you're also giving us a solution, right? And what do we need to do? So here's the problem, here's the pattern, here's the details, and here's the antidote. And I just think it's really well put together. And I think anyone, spending time with you like we did at Richard Rohr's conference, just walk away with a lot of ideas and inspiration to try to bring that consciousness forward. And it's a two-part system, right? Like, you have to deal with the empire consciousness. You have to understand what that is and what is the nature of the shadow that's operating. And then you also have to figure out the way through that. So can you say something more about that? How do we articulate what that is in terms of our own life and experience?
I'm going to share something from Herb Goldberg, who wrote this in the 70s. I've been involved in men's issues since the 60s and 70s. So Herb Goldberg had a book called The New Male. That was in the 70s. And he said, the blueprint for masculinity is a blueprint for self-destruction. The masculine imperative, the pressure and compulsion to perform, to prove himself, to dominate, to live up to the masculine ideal, in short, to be a man, supersedes the instinct to survive. The brittle male conducts his life by his ideas about masculinity. Living up to the image is the important thing. As his isolation and distrust, the hallmarks of successful masculinity, increase, so do his drive for power and control and his inner rage and frustration. Traditional masculinity is a psychologically defensive operation rather than an authentic and organic process. Mm. Now, that last sentence is the most powerful thing I've ever read about what's going on right now. Mm. Because once you have a defensive operation rather than an authentic and organic process, you basically lose your inner being to be part of a system.
Because you're reacting, you're no longer creating a solution to life.
And you don't know what your center is, and you don't know how to connect to your center. And you lose all connection, because isolation and distrust are part of the empire system. So basically, he was using different language, but he was talking about being groomed to be part of an empire. And what you do is you give up yourself for it, just like you give up yourself to die for your country. Whether you believe in the cause that you're fighting for or not, there's this idea of disposability for men and self-sacrifice for men. So if you don't matter and who you are, you don't know who you are. Mm-hmm. Jeff Morgan had a song in the 70s. It was called Nobody Knows You. But it's also, you don't know yourself.
And how can you be co-creative and co-responsible with other beings when you're not even taking care of yourself and you're not even connected to yourself?
So what happens with all these losses of that is, how do you empathize with somebody else if you don't know who you are? I mean, if you can't feel feelings, how do you feel or get an empathy for what somebody else is feeling? So what this process, he says this really well. It's an isolation process. It's a separate, Terrence Real wrote a book called I Don't Want to Talk About It, which was a book about men and depression. We have lots and lots of men who are experiencing depression. And we have lots of men who are experiencing addiction. And addiction and depression and violence and rage all come from this loss of wholeness, this loss of connection to self. So when that is lost, that is an incredible hole in your heart. And everybody has to look at that. Now, one of the things that spirituality can do for people, it can help them reparent themselves. And also by finding support networks of like-minded people who can care about you because they care about themselves, you can reparent that way too. Mentoring is another way to reparent. And what we all basically need is to learn to love ourselves,
Mm.
and then we can love everybody.
I think
Uh,
that's such a huge point to make. Is in lieu of a healthy response, we have all the other responses. We have, seeking to feel good through addiction. It can be in money and wealth accumulation. It can be in material experience. It can be in sensory experience. It can be in very highly concentrated forms of energy and drugs and things like that. It could be in media. I mean, whatever it is that gets their dope levels up and we feel good again, right? And at a deep level is that hurt part of ourselves. Um, and for me, that really speaks to me because that was the doorway by which I I went from unconscious base of activity into conscious activity. It was picking up Bly's book, picking up Iron John, and beginning that inner parenting process. So could you just say something about what that might look like for men who don't have a lot of understanding about that, or just people in general? Because it's not just men, right? I mean, everyone needs to have an access to with that energy. And why is that important, archetypally or emotionally?
well, you have to feel loved and you have to feel lovable in order for you to be loving in the world. Um, that love is part of knowing who you are and being connected to your feelings, your thoughts, your ideas, your beliefs, and actually creating your own passion, your own self, your own energy in the world, and then having a purpose that is meaningful. So you get meaning from what you're doing, whether it's helping other people or whatever you're doing. I mean, I think all kinds of people are helping other people in various ways. I think repair people who repair equipment are helpers. I think nurses and doctors are helpers. I mean, we can go on about all the different. Um, so purpose is not part of empire. In other words, when you have this defensive operation going on, it isn't about, well, who am I on the inside? What do I really need? What do I want? Um, what happens to this with this loss is trauma. And when there's a trauma, the part of the brain gets stuck. You get stuck in a part of your brain, which is a fight flight response, and it can be also an anger rage response. My buddy Dave Decker, who has a really great website, which I'm on also, called angerresources.com, talks about the shame rage connection. And when there's a lot of shame, it leads to rage. The addiction that you're talking about, trying to get validation from things, is they're temporary fixes, and they may last for a little while, but they don't really heal the hurt. And the hurt is, I'm not enough, I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy, I'm not lovable, uh, and also I don't know who I am. If I don't know who I am, what can I give the world?
Right.
And we get our meaning from being in the world, not of the world, but in the world, giving whatever love we can give in whatever way works for us. Where there's only one ultimate purpose, and that's to be of service in the world to create more love and peace. That is the purpose. There's an infinite number of ways that can happen. Um, in order to feel that way, to feel that lovability and desire to give, you have to feel like you have enough yourself. And you have enough yourself it's an inside job.
It's not about how much money you have in your bank account, or it's not about having all the right pieces in your life figured out, which is what Empire tells you, right? That if you don't have this car, this kind of house, this kind of lifestyle, right, you're not okay.
It's all external stuff, and it doesn't ultimately solve the problem. It temporarily is a distraction. And I think one of the ways that an empire culture works is it's distracting people all the time into external validation hunts. Okay, where am I going to get celebrity and being famous
Mm-hmm.
and having that kind of power is also something that people use to try to fill the hole. But it does, So how many likes did I get? Or how many, there's a list of ways you can validate yourself through social media, which I don't think really ultimately solves the problem, because it's an inside job. So people need time apart. They need sweat lodges. They need deserts to hang out in. And they also need spiritual support and guidance from elders and wise people who've worked on this journey. And one of the things we do in America, Robert Bly wrote this book called The Sibling Society, where he said, people aren't willing to learn from elders as much as they used to, because they now have all the information at their fingertips. They don't need to go to a person. That's different than actually getting life experience from hanging out with somebody and having them tell stories. So I want to talk about storytelling for a minute. We need to start telling stories to each other about our lives. That's why I started out with a little story about me, because it's like, you have to know this about me to know me. You have to know what motivated me to get really serious. So in a way, this bullying, which was part of an empire consciousness at the time, I mean, what they really wanted to do, which is what Hitler wanted to do, was eradicate a whole race of people, a whole religious group of people. He killed 6 million of them. Why did he need to do that? Well, they were scapegoated and blamed for things that weren't their fault. That's what we do, project onto other people. So I'm not saying we're all like that, but I'm saying there is a tendency in people to try to control things they can't control, and to blame things on things that are it's not their fault. In the movie Good Will Hunting, at the very end, the therapist says to Will, when Will shows him the x-rays of his abuse, he says, "It's not your fault. It's not your fault. It's not your fault." And I think when you're part of Empire Consciousness, deep down, you're taught it's your fault.
Yeah.
It's all your fault. And you're bad. And the other thing I think we tend to do too much with an empire is label everybody something.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's really toxic. Labeling itself is toxic.
Yeah, because it ignores that we're all children of the universe who happen to have a condition or an issue or an illness or whatever, but we are not that illness or we are not that condition. So labeling is another way to dismiss people, to make them not matter.
And it creates more division.
Yes.
And then I don't have to treat people well, right? Because now I can say, well, this group is this way and they have this label. I can ignore them. I don't have to pay attention to them at all. I'm no longer responsible for treating them as something that deserves respect.
It also generates a fear of them, because once you start treating people like that, you're afraid they're going to treat you like that, or they're going to do something against you.
And the cycle, that consciousness, that empire consciousness, just continues that. Well, that's a really good point, that the victim consciousness or the labeling activity, that behavior itself is part of the empire consciousness and should be called out. Like, the more we try to figure out, what my niche of hurt is, my brand of trauma, and my entitlement to claim that, I think is perpetuates misery, until we recognize that at a deep level, we're all wounded. We're all trying to figure this out. I may have started out with more or less pieces on the table, but in truth, at a deep spiritual level, I have to acknowledge that empire consciousness, that destructive force is operating in all of us, right? So we have to equally take that on.
Yes, I agree with you totally on that. I also think I am not my wound. The new book out by Oprah Winfrey and Dr. Bruce Perry talks about what happened to you, as opposed to I am a this. It's like things happen to people, but they're not their fault, and they don't define them. So when something happens to you, you can see it as something you can heal, but it wasn't about you in some level. In other words, they used you as a scapegoat, but it wasn't about you personally. And when you start not taking personally the negative stuff that happens, it says, oh, they're wounded. That's why they're acting out that way. It's not really about me. I'm still a lovable child of the universe.
That's really hard to do, don't you think, when you're looking at your oppressor and looking at the power they're wielding and the destruction that they're creating, and to say, yeah, but there's a wounded entity in there. Is that pretty hard to do that in that moment?
Sure. I also think we need to get away from our oppressors, by the way. I mean, I think one of the things we do as that positive warrior energy, and we try not to hang around a whole lot of people who are going to hurt us. Now, as a small child, you don't have a choice. You're sent to school. They don't say, oh, you get to evaluate who these other 30 kids are in your class, and you get to evaluate whether you want to be with this teacher or not. You don't. You get to evaluate what parents you get to have. You don't. We're thrown into situations and we're helpless and powerlessness. The one thing I want to say about the way people survive is sometimes their defenses save them from total self-destruction.
Yeah.
So even though defenses may no longer work once you're older,
right,
and they're not helpful, you still have to appreciate that they may have saved you. So I know somebody who got lost in video games as a child, and it saved him from being annihilated. And now as a young adult, he has to figure out how to not stay as immersed in, because we tend to be loyal to whatever saves us.
Oh, sure.
But defenses are not only bad. They're survival mechanisms.
Well, I would say that's true about addiction. And we talk about this in the men's recovery work I do, is not to overly demonize your addiction. We tend to put like the label of Diablo over that substance. And the problem with there's a lot of problems when you do that. And one of them, of course, it's going to have power over you. But the other one is that, to a certain degree, that substance or that part of your life may have saved you from something that you weren't ready to face, right? And so it was a medicine. And now that medicine itself has become the poison. And you have to rise above that and figure that out. But it does invite you back to your core. And that's the crazy part about, trickster alcohol or trickster heroin or whatever, is that it forces you back to your story on some level. Because in order to deal with the junk, the poison in the bottle, the poison in the pill, you have to deal with what else is going on inside of you, right? And that's what your work is pointing towards. You kind of be willing to unpack that and look at it.
So here's the way you look at it. You're a lovable child who needs love, doesn't necessarily receive it, doesn't mean you didn't deserve it. You deserved love. You may not have gotten it. You might have gotten shame. You might have gotten abandonment. You might have gotten a lot of things that you didn't deserve, but you deserve love. And that part of you was never hurt by the oppression that you experienced. There's a part of you that is still spiritually connected, that is still lovable, that is divine, that is whatever you want to call it.
Pure.
And that's your essence. That's your essence and your core. And that's what you get back in touch with. That part of you that is totally lovable. And then you start connecting with other people who are working on getting there too, so that you get a group of people who say, we are lovable. Yes, we've been through hard stuff, but we are all lovable. Every one of us is lovable. And we didn't deserve whatever negative experience we had growing up. We were helpless as small infants. I mean, if you get really ultimately abandoned as a small child, you die. And, so you got to do what they want you to do in order to survive, or they'll throw you out into the street and then you'll die. I'm not saying that's totally rational, but you're a 1 month-old child. So whatever systems we become part of, whether it's a family system, a cultural system, an empire system, we're taught that is the way it's supposed to be.
That's right.
And the healing process is realizing that isn't the way it's supposed to be. Marianne Williamson says, we were born with love and we were taught to fear.
It's all about what teaching. What teaching are you subscribing to? What's your operating system, right? Is going to determine your life. Not that this or that happened, but by what system are you operating truly defines you, regardless of what happens to you.
The oneness consciousness starts with yourself, loving yourself. And then it moves to loving people like you who are similar. Then it moves to loving everybody, because there's divinity in everybody and there's a connection in everybody, you know. So we have to start focusing on how we're alike, not just how we're different, because we are different in certain ways, but we are also very, very core as a baby, 1 month old. We have a lot of similarities as a 1 month old baby, you know.
So how do I do this, Doc? How do I go from being unconscious much of the time and projecting my, wounds onto the world and tending to lapse into addiction when I'm not feeling right? How do I really shift from that into oneness where I'm really taking care of myself and loving others as we ought to be?
It's about being reprogrammed.
Hmm.
It's almost like you gotta go around hang around the loving people. You got to do a 12-step program. If it's the right program for you, if it's the right connection. Some people, it works for some people. Other things work for other people. You got to find your spiritual base, your spiritual support network, the people who really love you. You've got to create your new family and find your new family, the people who are going to be there for you because of who you are on the inside, not what you show on the outside. And that's a process. But so mentoring programs, spiritual programs. I go to Unity Minneapolis, and it is a loving community, and that makes a big difference for me. That to know that I am loved for who I am, because the people there tell me that. And so you got to say it, you got to affirm it, you got to repeat it. It's almost like, immerse yourself in the spirit, immerse yourself. Chanting, for people historically, they had all kinds of ways of feeling connected. In the Jewish tradition, there was the prayers that were said out loud that were, uniform prayers that people said. There's chanting, there's all kinds of, dancing, moving. And what it does is we have to get our whole bodies into it and our whole being into it and our whole mind into it. So it's immersion. It's an immersion experience.
Not just immersing myself, but all of my senses, all of my faculties have to be immersed in this energy to take me where I want to go.
Yeah, and it has to be strong enough to combat all the messages we're still going to get about how we're not enough and how we have to prove ourselves. I wrote a piece a long time ago that was in the Men's Center newsletter. It was called "The Trauma of Proving Manhood." And actually, to prove manhood is a trauma, which most people don't talk about like that. Because we don't have to prove anything. We already are lovable. We already are whole. We already are connected. It's almost like that gets ripped away. And I think the idea of a spiritual the loss of our true connections and inner selves and spirituality is what causes all the pain. So I'm going to just share a couple of things that I wrote. Spiritually connected men and boys and others too live in oneness consciousness, not empire consciousness. They focus on love, not fear. They live with the belief about abundance, not scarcity. They engage in practices which connect them with spirit, themselves, and others. They listen more and speak less. They have no desire to control, dominate, shame, or manipulate others. They have respect for all living beings, all of creation. They live in the moment and let go of the past. They're interdependent and share power, ideas, love with others. They care about the earth. For men, they are involved fathers, uncles, grandfathers, mentors, group members. They are reliable, accountable, and trustworthy. Okay, and trust is very much a part of oneness consciousness. Mistrust is part of empire consciousness. So we're supposed trust, Eric Erickson said, other people have said, is the cornerstone of emotional well-being and development. So we have to trust ourselves, trust selected others, trust the universe, and trust life itself in the process, living in process, growing, changing. Everything changes and ends. Everything changes and ends. We don't need to be the center of attention. We enjoy stillness and quiet. We take good care of our health, and we live with radical forgiveness. And radical forgiveness means that whatever happened got you to where you are. And it's a miracle. I talk about myself as a walking miracle. That's from Simon Birch, a movie. And we're all walking miracles.
Right on.
Because given how we started and given what happened to us, it's a miracle that we still are loving, optimistic, caring, compassionate. You know, all of those things, it's a miracle. So that's how when I work with mentees, I've had probably 500 mentees over the years. And I have about 35 or 40 ongoing ones now. And some for 20 years, some for longer than that. You know, they said in Perry's book, Bruce Perry's book, that you can actually change someone's brain by loving them consistently over a period of time.
Wow.
So that's what I hope for all of us.
Starting with this one, right?
Yeah. Well, the brain, and then it connects, the brain and the heart are connected. Okay. So love yourself, love others, love spirit, and see yourself as a walking miracle. And when you look at somebody else, you go, wow, they're a walking miracle too. It's amazing they survived those things that they survived.
Regardless of whether or not they're treating you well, regardless of whether or not you see them as that label, it should just be something that we do all the time if we're going to get out of this. Is that right?
You also want to protect yourself and not be in anything that is going to abuse you. I want to make that really clear. That does not mean hanging out with people who are abusive to you in the present time.
Right.
It means being selective about who you hang out with. You can love them from a distance. That's what I do.
Right.
Love them from a distance.
In spite of themselves, or in spite of how they're treating me, I can still love that person and have boundaries, because that's loving me.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Well, this has been an amazing conversation, and I feel like, and I told you right at the beginning, like, I think the worst thing that's going to happen is we're going to have so many interesting side things that we could talk about and things that bubble up in here, and I do feel really inspired by this, and yet you know, it is time to call it close for today's session, and it's been fantastic having you in this conversation. I really enjoy having this dive into oneness consciousness and into that as an antidote to empire consciousness, and I think it's a good invitation for all of us to take a closer look at that and how we can learn and grow from what you're saying and what you're sharing. So thank you, really.
Thank you. Blessings to everyone.
Right on.
Is there anything that, for follow-up, how if people want to learn more about you and your work, a website, or how do we get to it?
There's a bunch of them. There's mentorsmatter.us, which is my website. There's my buddy Dave Tillman's website, which I have a lot of articles and YouTube videos. I've got 10 YouTube videos. If you go to Mike Obsatz Porch Talks, because they were filmed outside during COVID, there's 10 different videos, and one of them is from empire consciousness to oneness consciousness. There's one on men in isolation and loneliness and how to overcome that. There's one on shame. There's a whole lot of information there on lifesjourney.us. Lifesjourney, one word, .us. There's also Dave Decker's website, angerresources1r.com. And he and I have worked together for a really long time and done stuff on anger and rage and domestic violence prevention and curing and healing. So that's a third place. I've written for the Men's Center newsletter, if you want to look at some of the articles I've done for that. And my books, the most popular book was Raising Nonviolent Children in a Violent World but let's do this again, and we can continue.
Absolutely.
All right.
And thank you for being part of the advisory board for the nonprofit Seven Feathers Society, which is really getting going this year. And in hearing you talk, I'm reminded about why, I really see you as one of my core, advisors and mentors and elders over the course of time, because so many of the things that you say really resonate with the mission and the work that I do. So thank you very much. I really appreciate you.
Sure, man. Thank you. And I want to just mention that Charlie Borden and Kevin Obsatz, my son, were involved very centrally in the Journeyman movie. We did it as a collaboration.
Right on.
So all three of us worked on that for a couple of years to put that together. And that is still available to Journeyman. So,
all right.
So thank you.
Until next time, sir. Have a good one.
Take care.
All right.
Bye-bye.
And have a good day, all. Take that with you, and hope to see you next time. Thank you. This is Warrior Dan with Warrior Evolution. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the bell to get the latest updates and notifications about when our next podcast or videocast is coming out. Thanks again for tuning in. And if you'd like to learn more about the kind of work that we're doing, you can check out the new nonprofit website, www.sevenfeatherssociety.org. Thanks again, and make it a great day.